All right, we are going to get started tonight. How's everybody doing? It's great. Y'all all look like a blur. I have zero contacts in, so y'all can make faces at me like Rick's probably doing right now, and I would never even know. And so, not yet? Okay. Well, that'll start here in a little bit. So, let's go ahead and have prayer requests. Rick said he has a long list to start with, so I guess we'll go ahead and start, Rick, with whatever your long list for prayer requests are. Yep. Ooh. Okay. Okay. Yeah, he's like, whatever, probably, yeah. Carol decided Ken's got to go. That means Ken said, I'm good. And then today, Carol said, no, you're not. And let's go. Okay. Well, definitely remember them in our prayers. He did. Yeah. So, anything else that we need to remember in our prayers? Remember Sarah was having a biopsy? She did have that yesterday. Okay. So definitely is okay. Good. So let's definitely remember Sarah in our prayers and Roger in our prayers for that too. Anything else? All right. Well, let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we are humbled and we are grateful to be able to come before your throne on behalf of all of these that have been mentioned tonight and those that are in car wreck, Ken with falling, and Sarah with her biopsy. And Father, there are so many that are just hurting, and we're asking that you will be with them, that you will comfort them as you know how, and that, Father, you will be with all the medical professionals that are taking care of these situations. And Father, we just pray your blessings upon them and as they recover, and for the loved ones that are taking care of them. Father, we are grateful for the avenue of prayer that we have through Jesus, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right. What I decided we were going to do here in the summer, since summer's kind of haphazard, especially with, like we had camp last week and other things going on. What I thought we would kind of do just for the summer, since kind of getting a late start on it anyway, is I kind of wanted to take off what we did in Genesis and kind of look at how this all connects with the rest of the Old Testament leading us to Jesus. Kind of like a survey, but not quite a survey of the Old Testament, just hitting some points along the way. Because I think what we established when you looked at the book of Genesis is how, and if you go back from the very beginning, and what we were describing is that Genesis is a book that is Moses trying to explain how God was working through different people and eventually one family, and his ultimate goal is to get us to the Messiah, ultimately to Jesus. And what you find taking place throughout the rest of the Old Testament, of Exodus and Leviticus, Deuteronomy, we're not going to spend time in every single one of these books, but going through even to when we get the conquering of the Promised Land, getting to the prophets especially, everything that you see unfolding in the Old Testament is leading to that one time where Jesus is finally going to come. And I want us to look at the Old Testament in that way, instead of looking at it as a bunch of stories put together to form a book, if that makes sense. Because I think when we can look at it in this picture, you get a different understanding. For instance, and Paul talks about in Romans chapter 15, that the things that were written for our foretime, the Old Testament, were written for our learning. Not just a bunch of little stories that we have cute VBSs for and things like that and can preach over, but that this is God's plan unfolding for his people and ultimately for humanity. And that's kind of what the Old Testament story is. It is God's plan unfolding, and it's pointing to one thing written throughout. Now, does that mean every little story that is in the Old Testament is about Jesus? No, not necessarily. You know, when you think of, I'm thinking of when you get into the Judges and you think of Samson, not quite sure that had a connection really to Jesus a lot. However, when you are in Joshua and you hear the story of Rahab, then you see it unfold and how God's plan works through. Or when we get into the book of Ruth and we see Ruth and that story and how she's a Moabite, she eventually marries Boaz, and then there's Obed that's born, then there's Jesse that's born, and then there's David that's born. And you start to see this story unfold. So when we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's all leading up to this. And so that's kind of where I wanted us to just kind of look for this summer over these few weeks that we have here. And probably when we get to school starting in August or whatever, we'll shift gears a little bit. But just for these few weeks, kind of diving into that. And of course, where our story takes us next, we're not going to go verse by verse. We're only hitting a couple of high points in certain things, is of course the book of Exodus. The story of Genesis doesn't end with Jacob dying, right? It ends with the continuation, and it continues on going through. And in fact, when you get into Exodus chapter 1, you begin right away seeing all the sons and everything that were there that we've just studied for all these weeks leading up to it. Verse 6, Joseph dies, all his brothers and generations. So everybody in that family is, at least the older generation, is passing. Verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied, grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So if you remember from where we were just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how when Joseph brings his family into the promised land, he settles them in northern Egypt, in the northern part of the Nile. It's in a very fertile area. It is in an area in which they can thrive. There was also the other part of this story. Remember that who was in charge of Pharaoh's cattle? Their family was. So they had food. They had plenty of land from which to grow things. So it was a very fertile place, and they were very fertile, and they grow and multiply. And that sets the backdrop for what we find in the book of Exodus. As I said, we're not going to go through all of it. We're not going to get to Moses calling, but just so we understand what we're talking about here. Verse 8 of chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So understand what we're talking about in a time frame here. You will see a timestamp when we look at chapter 12 here in just a second. You will see the timestamp that will say somewhere along 430 years. So we're not talking about something that just 100 years later. We're talking about, and if you remember, we've talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago. When you look at our country of the United States, we are 249 years old. So we still have another 200 years to go to get where we're at with these people. And it started with 70-ish people, far as the family, plus the rest of their crew that came. So in this 400 years, I mean, think about what we have done in our country in 249 years. Between settlers coming over, people populating where we're at, and where are we at now? 355 million, roughly, in the United States. I'm not saying there's 355 million people here. I'm just saying once people start multiplying, people start multiplying. So this gets Pharaoh really freaked out, to the point where he is afraid, now I have basically another group of people who are foreigners living in my land. All they need is a little bit of help from somebody else. They can take over what we have. And so that is the backdrop from where we find the beginning here in Exodus and the story that's about to unfold. In fact, verse 11, you see they are dealing very heavily with these people. They're building the cities. I'm not quite sure that we can say, I know movies like to come back and say that the Hebrews built a lot of what you see in Egypt. Some of the dates do not add up at all, and so that's not going to be. I know that we want to sit here and say, oh, there the pyramids were built by them. No, they weren't built by them. So get that out of your head. I know movies like to do that, but that's not exactly. But verse 13, let's back up a little bit. Verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. So you kind of get this picture. The Egyptians are being more mean toward them. Well, they're multiplying and they're having more people. And it says, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So now you have come in a 430-ish plus year period. Actually, it's going to be less than that at this point because Moses hasn't popped onto this scene yet. So we still have another 80 years before he pops back up and gets freed. So we're at what, 350-ish? 350 years at this point. So what we have is we have a people who are basically about to be turned into slaves, because remember, they weren't slaves necessarily with Joseph. They were guests in the land. But now it's taken over to go in something else. And so this is the backdrop, verse 13. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter and hard in service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of works in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. That is the backdrop from which we find Exodus beginning. We have left Moses and how I want to say this, the safety in which Moses had with his people, to now we are being treated as just slaves, and we're not being treated very well. So, and like I said, we're not going to get into this deeply in here, but what we have taking place over those next few verses is the story where Pharaoh is saying, okay, we're going to have to start weeding out some of these. These Hebrew people are multiplying, and we cannot handle this, and this is where Pharaoh's commanding, verse 22, that every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Why do you think they were letting the daughters live? There's probably another little side to this in here. Why do you think he's letting the daughters live? Okay, they don't carry the family name. There's probably not a biggest fear of ladies fighting back against Pharaoh. There's probably also another little thing in there too. What now? Correct. There is an idea of, well, we can take the ladies and we will breed with them. Sorry, ladies, not to be crude with that, but that's basically what the idea is. And so there is the mindset, and that's what you have setting up here when you get in chapter 2 with Moses. And of course, we know the story of Moses. Moses is put into the basket. His sister is sitting there watching this. Sister is probably the oldest of the kids that are there, because not quite sure we can sit here and put Aaron in this picture yet. So here is his sister watching all this take place, and of course we understand that here is Moses. He's taken up and he is raised in Pharaoh's home. See if I can actually get to my class of what we're going to do tonight in here. Of course, he's named Moses, and so what Moses is going to do is very uniquely similar to Joseph. What allowed Joseph to be able to handle both the Egyptian and his family? He did have power, but he's also, he's bilingual. He's raised in Pharaoh's home, and so he had the power of raising up into Pharaoh's home and doing all these things, at least working under Pharaoh, so he wouldn't have the quite education that Moses has. Now you have Moses, he's going to be educated in the Egyptian lifestyle, in the Egyptian world. So he is also going to understand, and this also goes to another thing with movies that pop out that I'm not quite sure you can nail. A lot of people say that this would be Ramses II, I believe, that they will try to nail it and say that it's Ramses, and that Moses and Ramses may have been raised together in similar things. Not quite sure, going back to your movie things, not quite sure you can say that. So just be careful when you see that. However, he would be raised in this society and understand their culture, understand their laws, understand their things. And that's how Moses is raised and grown up. Of course, he learns about who he is. Verse 11, he's striking down the Egyptian that is treating the Hebrews bad. We're not going to go into all of this because we're eventually going to get to our class tonight. But this also makes Moses afraid, because here's Moses standing up and he says, "Who made you a prince?" This is verse 14. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses is afraid and he leaves. He is about 40 years old at this point. He leaves and goes to the land of Midian. I do want to hit this for a second in Midian. And this is where I don't want us to move and lose this point when we talk about God working with people. He is about to meet his future wife, Zipporah, and her father's name is Jethro. What does Jethro do? He's a priest of God, and he's not a Hebrew. Don't get so lulled into what we're thinking. And this is why I wanted us to kind of take this view of this and not look at the Old Testament as just a bunch of stories that are put together and it's all about the Jews, which it is focusing on the Jews. God is still working in humanity away from what you have written in this Old Testament. The Old Testament is the unfolding of God's plan to bring us about the Messiah. That is what you're going to hear me say all summer long. So if you don't like it, sorry, you're just going to hear that over and over. Because we have to get and understand this is how he unfolded it. But this is a perfect example of Jethro, who is a priest of God, and God is still working with other people at this time. We do not have a law. We do not have a law of Moses written down. We don't have that. That takes place in a few chapters. So this is still God working with people. Yes. Yes. Ishmael. What you have and you really see it in the Middle East even today, what you have is all of these people constantly interacting in this. Because think about it, this is where the majority of the world is. It's sitting here from basically northern Africa toward what would be modern day Western Iran, probably, over toward Turkey. I mean, this is basically where the world is sitting at this point. I mean, we're going to spread out, and people are going to spread out more, but far as what we know and modern life is in these areas. But what I do find it, and I want us to hit that, is this is still God working with other people, even though he chose Abraham's family to be the Messiah, to be the vehicle from which the Messiah would come. So I think we have to be careful, even as preachers and teachers. We will sit up and we'll say, well, salvation's of the Jews, because Paul talks about that, especially in the book of Romans. And we'll talk about how, because I'll even talk about it, how Cornelius unlocks the door to the Gentiles. And there is truth to that. At this point, though, God is still working with all people in here. And it also goes to show what has already been established at this point that the Jews hold dear as a signet or a symbol of their faith. It'd be for males. Circumcision. It's already been established in here. And that is the thing that they hold dear. In fact, that's what the early church struggled with even when letting the Gentiles in, because they weren't being circumcised like they did under the law of Moses. So you have all of this setting up. Chapter 3 is the burning bush. That's when God's encouraging and enlisting Abraham to go and to move forward. We've talked a little bit about that, but then Moses heads back to Egypt. So at this point, Moses is about 80 years old of where we are sitting at. So now we're getting closer to that 430 years. But I want to back up one more time in chapter 2 real quick before we go further in here. This is why you got to be careful that at least the Pharaoh that instituted this was not the Pharaoh that Moses is going to interact with. Verse 23, during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant that he made with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And so even though, and so now put yourself, let me ask you this here. Put yourself in the shoes of the Hebrews. How would you like to be praying for 80 years and not getting a prayer answered? We're not patient about tomorrow. So here they are praying for all these years to get released, and they didn't. They didn't see it, but God is opening a door to do that, and here comes Moses. So Moses is he's finished his 40 years of exile. He's coming back. He's doing his thing. He comes back to Egypt in chapter 4. He finds them, has the conversation with Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh's like, nope, we're going to make it even worse on you. And then the people get upset because of all of this. And so then we get into chapter 7. And we're leading. I promise we're actually getting to the class here in a second. Then we are leading up to chapter 7, which begins the series of 10 plagues. This is the plagues of Egypt. If you ever want to know where the plagues of Egypt come from, do just a quick Google search on the gods of Egypt. The plagues have a direct correlation to the gods of Egypt. You've seen the pictures like the gods that have like, oh, what's the one? What's it called? I can't remember the name. It has the frog head. Well, what's the second plague? Frogs. First plague is turning the river to blood. Well, that is actually a couple that they went after there with that plague. You have locust, which goes toward Osiris. You have all these different plagues that come, and then darkness, the ninth plague, is the god Ra, the sun god that popped out. So there's a direct battle against that over these next few chapters, and then we get to chapter 11. Now we're actually getting into class. So then we get into chapter 11, and verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Yet one more plague I will bring upon Pharaoh, upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that they may ask every man and his neighbor for gold, for silver and gold jewelry." And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt. So you have this, verse 4. Moses said, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and the firstborn of the cattle." Who is this plague against? All firstborn, even those that are Hebrews. Not called Israelites yet, but yes, the Israelites. Key to understanding this, that plague is about everybody. It is the ultimate plague that's battling every Egyptian god here. And that is what is setting up for this, even down to the cattle. It says in verse 6, "There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor will be again." Now, maybe Moses being a little hyperbolic, but his point is there's going to be a lot of death, and there's going to be a lot of people upset. Now, before we get into the actual class of chapter 12 here, what does these first 11 chapters of Exodus say about God and his character? Let me just stop at that one. What does these first 11 chapters say about God and his character? Okay. Means what he says what he means. Okay. 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 There is a beginning and an end throughout all of this. I'm sorry, I can't hear. Patient. Yeah. I struggle with where the Hebrews are in this situation. Okay, Moses is out having this conversation with God. We've been here busting our tail for the last 40 plus years, and we've been crying out and not getting anything, any relief out of this. But God does remember his promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay. Definitely doesn't get it, because think about what is about to happen. Let's get through this. We'll cross the Red Sea in a second. What is going to happen in a short amount of time, for those that know the story of Exodus, in a short amount of time after they cross the Red Sea? They're going to create a God. They're going to complain. They're going to be very quickly to forget, and they're going to say, "We had it better in Egypt." Pharaoh definitely changes his mind. He comes after them in that Red Sea in there. Whoops, sorry. That was not good. But they are going to very quickly forget where they came from. Moses, when he dies in the book of Deuteronomy, and we'll probably talk about this in maybe next week, the theme of Deuteronomy is remember and don't forget God. Because they're about to go to the promised land, and he says, remember where you came from, don't forget God. Remember where you came from, don't forget God. Yes? Okay. Yep. Yep. Correct. Nothing like that has been established yet. Well, and think about this, what you said. Oh, sure. Well, well, think about what they're at too. You just mentioned that they had the promise. Okay, that promise was 350 plus years ago. And the stories that they tell, yeah. And so I guess that's my point of what we're giving at. We do give them a hard time, but from a human standpoint, I'm not quite sure many of us wouldn't have been in the same spot. Yes. Well, you got to think it probably did take them a long time to build things because they didn't. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. Apparently, it looks like they were building something, especially because when Moses comes back, that's when Pharaoh says, okay, we're going to make it hard on you. Take the straw away. You got to get your own straw and do all this. Mm-hmm. Well, they probably definitely learned it. The Egyptians were not dumb people by any means. Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, then it goes back to the faith question. I'm going to go back to, you're correct. We don't have all this, and it makes you question, how did you see this and not believe? And we believe by not seeing. And there's the faith. And there's the challenging. And it also goes back to the human side of sometimes even if we were to see something, we still may not believe. Sure. Yep. Yep. This book's still unfolding. Yep. 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 Right. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that goes back to what Devon was saying. Yeah, that goes back to what Devon was saying because are they worshiping God? We don't know. We don't know because there's nothing recorded, so we got to be careful of what we're saying with that. They are in a foreign land, and you can tell they are heavily influenced. I believe personally, there's that influence of the Ten Commandments is influenced by a written law because they were used to a written law in Egypt. I think there's a correlation that God used something that they were already used to. And it's like, okay, well, here, I'll give you laws. I'll write them down for you. And sure. Correct. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Right. Movies. Yeah. Prince of Egypt. Correct. Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely, they did. Correct. Correct. And that's what you find unfolding in here. Yes, one more thing, and then we're going to jump back into the text here. Okay. Well, and then that's that faith part that comes back into it, especially when you're talking about with prayer. And this is a perfect example that we are, and we are a product of our culture and our society. And as much as we understand that, this is kind of what you see, I think, with the people of Israel here, especially when they get out. We are a product, they are a product of their culture and their society in which we live. Let's face it, I mean, you can turn on the TV, you can turn on the news, and you can watch what's happening in Iran and Israel right now. I was sitting something on YouTube earlier, and it was a live, I think it was Sky News out of England that was literally had a side-by-side view of Tehran and Tel Aviv. I mean, I could sit there and watch waiting for a rocket to come down. We live in a very instantaneous culture, and we expect God to work on that instantaneous culture as well in a lot of times. And I think when we pray, sometimes it doesn't happen at that moment, and things have to continue unfolding. Now, let's come back to this text here because I want us to go back to this because he has made this distinction. They're going to die, including you, if you don't do some things. So let's get into chapter 12. So here's where we have what we call the Passover. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of the months. It shall be the first month of your year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of the month of every man shall take a lamb according to his father's house, a lamb and for the household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and the nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make for your account for the lamb. So that's interesting. God basically he was establishing something. Here's what I want. However, it's almost saying, if you can't afford it, you got neighbors you can get and connect with. So I think that's interesting that God throws that out in all that. So first thing is, it's got to be a lamb. Verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old, so it's a year-old lamb. You take it from the sheep or from your goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. So now we're starting to get into, even though the Sabbath hasn't been established yet, you're starting to get, here's where, when light is disappearing, this is when you're taking care of some of this. Verse 7. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the house in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. So, continue verse 11. In this manner you shall eat it. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. So that's a lot of stuff getting here. So what is it? We got a lamb without blemish. We take the blood and we put it on the doorpost, and that protects us from when God passes over. And he recognizes that this is what is saving them from this ultimate death. Well, of course, we know what that's foreshadowing. And this is kind of where I want us to get to of these classes here. That is foreshadowing what is to come. And Jesus takes that exact same meal in Matthew 26. He takes that exact same meal, and that is when we talk about that Last Supper and what he's having there, we're talking about all these things that are included in this. Jesus then takes the unleavened bread out of it and the fruit of the vine out of it. And that's what he separates and consecrates and says, this is the supper that you're going to remember. He's using an example of, hey, you remember the Passover for all of these thousands of years. I'm going to give you something now to remember me. And it's what we do every first day of the week when we come and take of that. And he says, you do this as my memorial, in my remembrance of what I am doing. And so Jesus becomes that sacrificial lamb. This is the correlation back to this, where ultimately his death saves us from ultimate death. And that is the correlation, and that's the picture that you see here in Exodus that God is going to use throughout the ages until we get to the Messiah to come. Yes. 100% he did. And that's what he is, because Jesus becomes our Passover lamb. He's without spot, and blemish. Put two words together there somehow. He's without spot, he's without blemish, and so he is that unleavened bread that has nothing in there to hold it back. He has no sin. He's ultimately raised and he's ultimately sacrificed so that we can do it. Remember what John said when Jesus came to be baptized? Y'all remember? Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so from the very beginning of his ministry, John, when he's doing the baptism, is saying this is who this lamb is going to be, tying all the way back here to Exodus. And so how all of these stories unfold is the explanation of why we are here. So why was the blood on the door so important? Okay. It's going to be interesting because in Leviticus, and I can't remember the chapter and verse right now, it's interesting because Moses is going to write that life is in the blood. In fact, I think that's actually, they find that out after George Washington. Is that right? They were doing bloodletting and he was sick or whatever and reading the Bible and it's like, oh, okay, we don't need to do this anymore. They realized, letting blood out kills you. Duh. But they didn't get that. But the blood is what saved them ultimately being on the doorpost. That was there. And so now we get this imagery that is foreshadowing what is going to come with Jesus. And he is establishing this. Moses and Aaron are establishing this with the people, and God is establishing it. Because if you remember back, what does he say? You are doing this all the time. Verse 14, this is a memorial feast. You're going to do it throughout all your generations. You're going to keep this. That's why you have two, you got to, out of the feast that you find, especially when Jesus. Number one is your Passover, Day of Atonement, Pentecost, Yom Kippur, not really a lot. That's kind of something else in there. But especially with Day of Atonement, Passover, and Pentecost, those are major days. Rosh Hashanah is what, the New Year? Is that right? Is that Jewish New Year? End of the year feast that's in there. Those are the things that we're pointing to Jesus coming in this imagery. So let's skip on ahead here a little bit. Okay, we got a few minutes left. So we got the death, we got the plagues that have happened. Verse 33, just quickly. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. And so they took up all of their stuff. In chapter 13, this is where, I guess it was Rachel, you talked about the cloud of fire and fire that began to lead them out. Then we get to chapter 14, and we're going to see if we can get through this a little quick. The Lord said to Moses in chapter 14, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between, we're not getting all those cities' names, by coming by the sea. So here they are at the Red Sea. Where exactly in the Red Sea is up for debate. There's also an issue in Hebrew versus the regular Hebrew, the Septuagint, and some scribal issues. Is it Red Sea or is it Reed Sea? There is a difference, and both of them actually fit the area. Red Sea definitely it was like a sea. You had more thing. The Reed Sea is actually lower to the ground, and it is filled with mud and soot, which may lead to what happens with the chariots and Pharaoh coming after them. You figure out what you want to do for yourself in there. I'm just throwing that out of it. So here they are, they're ready to go, and Pharaoh is coming after him. Verse 6, he made ready his chariot, took his army with him. He took 600 chosen chariots. So Pharaoh is mad of this situation, and they're pursuing them. Verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. So this goes back to what we were just talking about a second ago. We've only been probably, roughly speaking, days in this journey. They've just seen 10 plagues take place. They just seen their kids saved because of this blood on the door. They have a cloud and fire following them, and they're still afraid. There is human nature. There's us. That We know, and this goes back to, it's a faith thing. It goes back to understanding some things. We know God's promises. Devon said a second ago, we know the end of the story. Yet we still struggle. So let's give these guys a little bit of a break here, because now they are afraid, because here comes this big army going over them, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, "Is it because we have no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die?" So this is not only they're afraid, they have now jumped from we're afraid and we're just prepared for death. We may look back and say, well, that's crazy, but human nature. Verse 12, is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. Yikes. How's that for prayer? How many of you, when you pray, okay, we get up and we can preach it, we can teach this. Pray, let it go, be silent, let God work. Okay, how many of us really do that? Joel does? Okay. Oh, you're just wanting to make a comment in there. Okay. Okay. Sure. Well, and you got to think about what they've experienced. Their experience with God is what? Up until weeks or two ago, nothing. As far as their big prayer of, hey, we're hurting here. And so here they are in an emotional distraught. They finally see something, they get out, and then now here comes that army coming back after them again, and Moses is like, all right, I need you to be quiet and watch God work. Well, it's kind of hard. Verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. Wow. What's God's response? You're overreacting. I guess God was talking to a man here, not a woman at this point for sure. Talking to Moses here, right? Sorry, I'm just joking with you ladies. A little bit of water. We're going to come back to that water in a way here in a second too. But you're overreacting. What are you doing? I got you. I already showed you. Because remember, and we didn't read it, but in chapter 3 and chapter 4, what did God give him in that scene with, well, not God give him, but what did God let him use to do different things with his staff? And he's basically saying, you got that staff. Remember, you used it for the snake and everything else. Use it here. I've given you it. Yeah. Okay.
Are we not going to address their shame?
Okay.
I told you to leave us alone. No, you didn't. You cried out to God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That is what you cried out. They're already grumpy. I want to go back to something you were saying, Judy, ago. But aren't we like this in that way? And I think that's what is beautiful, that why we need to read these stories a little more in depth versus, okay, this is just a cute little story that God put in this book for us to read, and then we get to Jesus and grace and all this stuff. because what you find unfolding, we did it in Genesis. You see it right here with the same people. They are struggling with the very same things that in 2025 you and I struggle with.
They were not totally unlike.
True. Mm-hmm. Well, and go through the rest of the story, and we don't have time to read it. You can read it for yourself. Starting verse 21, that's kind of where he reaches out his hand. The waters are split. They're going across on dry land, and you got these walls on each side, and here come the Egyptians to pursue it. And when they come on the other side, he stretched out his hand over the sea, and we got the story there that the sea returned to its normal course with verse 27. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, so no one remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Somebody explain to me how that worked. Wind, yeah, there you go. Giant hurricane came at that time. God. We have a same thing, imagery, in our Christian walk today. We call it baptism. How does God save us in it? I don't know. But he does. And we go through this, and he saves us from our past. He saves us from sin. He saves us from the punishment. And he brings us through it. And this is the imagery that you're seeing. So this is where you get when you look at God in the Old Testament. I think that's why we have I think we forget about what the Hebrew writer said, that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It means God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But we wrongly say God in the Old Testament is this mean God, and God in the New Testament is this graceful God. God is the same. He's been the same throughout history. If you didn't sit in our class in Genesis and not see grace throughout the book of Genesis, then you need to go back and read it again. Same thing right here. Yes. He is the author of this text, yes, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting because you're bringing up some interesting points, because in chapter 3, it is interesting because Moses is writing this about himself. Chapter 3 really doesn't paint Moses in the best light either. Here is God talking to him from this bush. Here's what I want you to do. And what does he do? I can't do that. I can't. I'll give you the words to say. I can't do this. Fine, take your brother with you. I'm the one who gave man to be able to speak. I'm the one who put the tongue in you. Don't worry, you can do it. But you do see his progression. That's part of why I think there was that 40 years in exile in a sense. Maybe Jethro taught him how to talk a little bit. I don't know. About Zipporah. Zipporah was an interesting character. Well, yeah, she's very pro-feministic before feminism was a thing. We will look next week, if you want to do it. We will spend time on the law because the law points us to Christ too. I don't want us to miss that because Paul talks about how the law points us to salvation. And so we got to spend some time in the law, 19, 20, 21, 22 in there in Exodus. Then we'll move and we'll get into the kingdom, the united kingdom, and before it divides and everything with David and stuff like that, of how all of this begins to unfold in the Old Testament. So questions, comments? All right. We will see you later.